It does not matter how many years, how many decades go without watching this movie. It is an unforgettable scene. So maybe she wouldn't have known what it felt like to actually truly be loved because she had never experienced it, because neither of them loved her. So hello, thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about Washington Square by Henry James, published in 1880, and I'm comparing it with the adaptation titled The Heiress, which is directed by the incredible William Wyler and was released in 1949. And this was requested by Mac1132. It had been on my radar before then because I'd seen this movie many years ago and I knew it was based on a book, so I was wanting to cover it, but I just kept putting it off. So it is thanks to Mac1132 for requesting it, for finally getting me to cover Washington Square and The Heiress. And then also, this was adapted yet again in 1997, and that adaptation is called Washington Square. And I had never seen that before until now. I watched it in preparation for this video. So the bulk of this video is going to be me comparing The Heiress to the book Washington Square, but then at the very end, I will share my thoughts on Washington Square from 1997. But yeah, I love old movies. I was raised on TCM, Turner Classic Movies, and so I love the old movies, classic Hollywood, those old actors, and I have covered some older Hollywood movies in the past, but I would like to get back into covering more. So It Happened One Night is based on a short story, like a novella, so that is one I have been meaning to cover for a while, but again, I just keep putting it off. So if It Happened One Night in particular is one you would love to see me cover, make sure you comment down below and I will do it sooner rather than later. But then I also have a couple Joan Crawford movies I want to do soon. So yeah, basically you will see more old Hollywood movies in the near future here at Why the Book Wins. But before getting into spoilers, I just want to say The Heiress is a fantastic movie, 5 out of 5 stars in my opinion. So if you have not yet watched it, please go see that movie before you watch the rest of this video. I highly, highly recommend it. From here on out, let's get right into the details of Washington Square / The Heiress, which means we will have spoilers going forward. So both book and movie are about Catherine Sloper and her father, Dr. Austin Sloper, and they are wealthy, and Catherine herself, so her mother died while giving birth to Catherine, and the mother was very rich on her own. And so because the mother died, Catherine gets an inheritance of $10,000 a year, and then when her father dies, in his will, she will get another $20,000 a year. And to put it in context, $10,000 in today's money is over $400,000. So as of right now, she's getting $400,000 a year. And then when her father dies, she will end up getting a total of $1.2 million per year. So she is a very wealthy heiress. But Catherine is very plain, despite her love for lavish clothing, which the movie does show how she loves to buy the nice dresses. And the movie, the costumes are designed by Edith Head, who is such an icon in the film fashion industry. She is incredible. And she designed the costumes for this movie. They are just superb. So yeah, in both book and movie, we find out that Catherine likes to dress very expensively, and she enjoys, the nice clothing and things. But regardless, she's just in general a very plain looking woman. And she's also very socially awkward and just not very bright. And her father sees her as a huge disappointment. And when a handsome young man named Morris Townsend expressed interest in Catherine and wants to even marry her, the father is very suspicious because he thinks so little of Catherine that he's like, how could this man possibly be in love with her? And in both book and movie, when he is talking directly to Catherine, it's not like he's straight up expressing his distaste for her in a direct manner. However, he does kind of give these backhanded compliments in a way, and he's always comparing her to her mother in a way that makes Catherine look bad. And then he also is talking, Catherine doesn't see this, but the viewer, the reader, sees him talking to one of his sisters named Mrs. Almond. And to Mrs. Almond, he is very blunt and direct in how little he thinks of Catherine, and how, again, in comparison to her mom, the mom was like so beautiful and so smart. And so he's like, wow, like it's a shame such an incredible woman gave birth to this dull, boring girl, and thank goodness her mother isn't alive to see how she turned out, essentially. And then we also get his inner thoughts in the book too. So in the book, you very clearly see how little he thinks of Catherine and just how mean he is to her in his mind, if not mean to her directly. But in the movie, it seems like the father and almost all of the characters, really, they are less detestable in the movie. And that could be because in the book, we get everybody's thoughts, and so that really shows a person's true colors is when you know what they're thinking. Whereas in the movie, we don't get that. There's no narration, there's no voiceover, so we don't know what their inner thoughts are. So that could be part of it. But then also when he suspects Morris of only liking Catherine for her money, in the book, he straight up tells Catherine this directly, pretty early on. Whereas in the movie, he's trying to be nice and he avoids saying this up until later on in the story. So yeah, in general, even without the, inner thoughts of these people, the movie did make them a bit more likable than they had been in the book. But Catherine respects and fears her father, and she wants to please him and impress him, which, he's a hard man to please, but especially for Catherine, it's like basically impossible for her to impress him, it seems. And I feel like her eagerness to impress him just makes him dislike her even more. But it's funny because when drama starts happening with Morris, he is talking to his sister again, Mrs. Almond, and he's saying something about how he never expected such a boring girl to make his life so interesting. And like now, he is more interested in Catherine now than he ever has been because she is causing this drama. It doesn't make him like her more because he just thinks she's stupid for being so gullible. But it just makes his life more interesting with this drama going on. And he's like, wow, I never thought such a dull girl would make such interesting drama happen, But in both, we can tell that he isn't trying to protect Catherine from Morris. Rather, he just likes to be proven right, and he takes pride in his intellect. And he can see the truth of Morris and wants to stop him from getting Catherine just to show that he knows best and to protect his own money, of course, which will go to Morris should they marry. So he is by no means doing this out of love for Catherine. And to go along with this, I just want to jump ahead real quick and talk about how in the end of the book, when Morris is going to end things with Catherine, he's talking to Mrs. Penniman, Catherine's aunt, and he's telling the aunt how Catherine will have her father to comfort her when Morris leaves her. And Mrs. Penniman says, her father will invent a new torture. Heaven deliver her from her father's comfort. It will consist of his crowing over her and saying, I told you so. But to talk about Morris, the first time they meet, so Catherine is attending her cousin's party because the cousin is getting married, and the man the cousin is marrying is a cousin to Morris. But we find out that Catherine's cousin is marrying a Townsend from like a high family branch, whereas Morris is from like a lower Townsend family branch. And so Morris is not from the respectable side of the Townsend family, but it is at this party where they meet. And in the book, we don't actually get like dialogue between Morris and Catherine. Like Henry James, he doesn't show us, he just tells us how this interaction goes. Whereas in the movie, of course, we actually do get dialogue and we actually see them interacting and we're shown what happens. And I loved this scene in the movie so much. Just even before Morris is introduced, just this whole scene at the party, fantastic. If you're on the fence about watching this movie, just watch this scene. I don't know if it's on YouTube or what, but if you can watch just this scene, it's so good and I guarantee you'll be hooked. The performances are amazing. And when we are first introduced to Morris, so we see Catherine and she is sitting down and someone is being like, oh, this is Morris. He wanted to meet you. And we just see his back and just the way the shot is framed is so interesting. How, it's a slow reveal kind of before we see Morris. But then Montgomery Clift as Morris is fantastic because he is so charming. And so you can see why Catherine is so taken with him, as well as other things that happen in the party. And like there's a guy who dances with her and he says he's going to leave to go get them something to drink, but then he never returns. And then this happens again with Morris where he goes to get something to drink and Catherine is like, oh, he's just going to leave me because that's what the last guy did. But then Morris, he really does try to come back with the drink. And so just in general, fantastic scene. I absolutely loved it. And of course, Olivia de Havilland is also incredible as Catherine. But yeah, anyway, in both book and movie, they meet at this party. And then from here on out, Morris, he keeps expressing interest in Catherine. And so he shows up at Washington Square making house calls. And then before long, the father tells them to invite him to dinner because Dr. Sloper wants to get to know this man who seems to be very interested in his daughter. And so they have him over for dinner. And the doctor can see that Morris is very smart and he's a fine physical specimen, but the doctor just does not trust him. And like I said, the movie makes the characters more likable, and this also includes Morris for sure, because in the book, you can just tell that he has bad intentions, right? He is only after Catherine for her money. He is very mercenary, as they say, and it is just so obvious. Whereas again, in the movie, Montgomery Clift, he really is very charming. And then of course he's handsome. Morris is described as being very handsome in the book too. And so the portrayal of Montgomery Clift makes you like him as Catherine is starting to fall in love with him too, because yeah, he's just so charming. Whereas in the book, I never thought he was charming and I was never buying what he was selling. And I think Henry James does that intentionally, right? Because the fact that Morris is so clearly only after her for her money, it just makes us realize all the more how gullible Catherine is and how naive and stupid she is for falling for him. However, something that is in the book, before Morris and Catherine get engaged, the father kind of calls things off. Like, he tells Morris directly that he does not like him, he doesn't trust him, he does not want him seeing Catherine, and he tells Catherine to stop seeing Morris. And Catherine is a very timid person, again, who wants to please her father. So she's like, okay, I won't see Morris anymore. But then there's a character named Lavinia Penniman, Mrs. Penniman, and this is Dr. Sloper's sister, so Catherine's aunt, and she lives with them. And Mrs. Penniman is swept up in the romance with Morris just as much as Catherine is. And so when she hears that they have been forbidden to see each other, Aunt Penniman sets up a secret meeting with Morris. And then from there, she returns home and tells Catherine, like, oh, he still wants to see you, like, give him another shot. Like, don't worry about disobeying your father. You just need to follow your heart. Like, you know, go see Morris again. And so in the book, things with Morris would not have escalated very much at all, except that Mrs. Penniman sets up this secret meeting and encourages them, you know, to get together. And in the movie, the father expresses his dislike for Morris. However, it is not until they are already engaged. And so the timing is just very different. And then the movie does not have the secret meeting between Morris and Mrs. Penniman. But to talk about Mrs. Penniman a bit more, in the movie, it seems like she has just recently moved in. Whereas in the book, when all of this is happening, Catherine is 22. And we find out that Mrs. Penniman has been living with them for 12 years. So it's funny because Morris is obviously a moocher. He just finds people to mooch off of, right? And that's how he gets by. And it seems like Mrs. Penniman isn't all that different. So maybe that's why they get along, is, you know, birds of a feather kind of a thing. Obviously, Morris is also manipulating Mrs. Penniman. But regardless, she comes across as kind of a mooch in the book herself. And in the book, she was just such a frustrating character. Again, she was less frustrating in the movie, but she was just so much worse. Like that secret meeting, for example. And the book also talks about how she just loves the drama of all of this. You know, she just loves creating her own little soap operas. And the book says how she doesn't consider what this will do to the emotions of those involved, namely Catherine. Like, she's not thinking of that. She's just thinking of her own entertainment value and the rush she gets from all this drama happening. And she also definitely has a crush on Morris. And in the book, we get her thoughts as well. And there's a part where she's thinking her husband has died. And she's like, wow, instead of Mr. Penniman, someone like Morris is who I should have been married to. But in the book, I also wanted to mention that, you know, we have these three siblings. Dr. Sloper, Mrs. Almond, and Mrs. Penniman are brother and sisters. And I just loved their dynamic in the book in particular. I just found it very relatable, the way Henry James wrote about the interaction between these siblings, these adult siblings, right? And Dr. Sloper and Mrs. Almond get along really well, and they see each other as equals, and they're able to have like actual conversations. Whereas Mrs. Penniman is just seen as kind of silly. And the doctor in particular, he doesn't have many positive conversations with her, and he doesn't really seem to respect her necessarily. But yeah, just the little details we would get about the dynamics going on between these three siblings, again, I just found so relatable. And it was just those little details that make the story feel so real and the characters all feel so genuine, you know? But then also Mrs. Almond, she is in the movie, but I think she was in more of the book than she was in the movie. But in both book and movie, Morris and Catherine end up getting engaged. And at the time, it was customary for the man to talk to the father first before proposing to the girl. However, Morris does not do that. He just proposes to Catherine and she says yes. And then at this point, it would have been appropriate for Morris to break the news to the father. But yet again, instead, Catherine offers to do it. And she's like, I'll talk to my father first, I'll soften him up, and then you can come and talk to him later. But in the movie, right before Morris arrives, the doctor has Morris's sister come to the house because he wants to meet her, because Morris is living with his sister. So he's like, I want to get a feel for who this guy is before I see him, and I want to find out what his sister has to say. Whereas in the book, he meets the sister after he has already talked to Morris. And in the book, he goes to the sister's house. And the conversation he has with the sister is also very different from book to movie. So in the book, he straight up tells the sister that he thinks Morris is selfish. And the sister, she's like, oh, like, yeah, he is definitely selfish, but I'm surprised you noticed because I think he's good at hiding it. And so the sister is much more candid in the book about her opinions of her brother. And she cares about him and she doesn't want to talk poorly. And yet at the same time, she's willing to admit his faults. And Dr. Sloper also mentions how Morris had an inheritance, and it was a small inheritance, but still, he got some money, which he then squandered, just like traveling and doing whatever he wanted. And the doctor is like, he could have used that money to help you because you're a widow with 5 children, but instead he just spent it on himself. And Morris had also told the father that he was tutoring his nieces and nephews. And so Dr. Sloper brings this up, asking about that. And the sister is like, oh yeah, like he teaches them Spanish. And that's all he does. And so Morris had made it seem like he was being more useful than he really was. But Dr. Sloper, he thinks learning Spanish is kind of a superfluous skill. And so he's like, wow, he's not even teaching them anything useful. He's, just this moocher who's living with his sister, trying to marry my rich daughter. And in the book, this woman has never met Catherine, but the doctor explains Catherine's demeanor and explains the situation. And so the sister, she's being surprisingly open about Morris, but it is because she has Catherine's interests at heart. And right before the doctor leaves, the sister tells him, don't let her marry Morris. And she says it like she doesn't want to say it, but it almost just kind of like burst from her despite her not wanting to admit it. And so the doctor, he gets what he wants from the sister, essentially. Whereas in the movie, the sister, she never straight up says anything bad about Morris, but there are times where she kind of skirts the question or doesn't directly answer. And so her reaction to certain questions kind of is an answer unto itself. And then in the movie, because they meet at the Sloper home, the father has Catherine come in. And so the sister sees firsthand how awkward and uncomfortable it is to be around Catherine and how difficult she is to talk to, as well as how plain she is. And then when Catherine leaves, the sister admits, like, yeah, it's odd that my brother is into her. But she kind of is like, well, maybe he's grown and maturing and he can see something within her that we can't, kind of a thing. But yeah, in the book, she was just more direct when she was talking to the doctor. But after Catherine and Morris are engaged, the father then says he wants to take Catherine to Europe for 6 months. And Aunt Penniman tells Catherine, like, oh, he's hoping that you and Morris will forget about each other, but you can't, like, you got to hold on to Morris. And Morris also tells Catherine, like, use this time to soften him up towards me, like, get him to approve of us while you're in Europe. But Catherine, she knows her father, right? So she's like, I won't be able to do that. Like, he's not going to soften up to us while we're in Europe. But regardless, they go to Europe. However, the separation, of course, does not deter Morris or Catherine. And when the father asks Catherine after some time, like, are you still going to marry him? Catherine tells him, yes, she is. Which, of course, is very disappointing to the father, and he is very cruel to her. Which, by the way, when Catherine talked to Morris about how the father wanted to take her to Europe, in the book she tells him, like, oh, I don't want to go, though. And Morris, his inner thoughts, he's thinking, like, what? Like, what a boring person. Like, why would she not want to go to Europe? Like, she's such an idiot. So again, those inner thoughts where we see the person for who they really are, and it just makes us dislike them all the more. And yeah, while she is away, Morris will frequently come over to Washington Square to keep Mrs. Penniman company. And we get a line when he is with Mrs. Penniman. And so Morris has just made himself at home at Washington Square. And there's a part in the movie in particular where he's like, man, it's a shame the doctor and I don't get along because we have so much in common. Meaning, he loves the doctor's taste and the finer things he has in his home. And Mrs. Penniman, when Catherine returns, she is kind of gloating about how much time she has spent with Morris. And she even says something. This is unique to the book. She says something along the lines of like, oh, you might think you know Morris, but I truly know him because I've gotten to know him so well in the past year. And she's just going on and on about Morris and all the time she spent with him. And Catherine is kind of bothered by this. But yeah, he does visit her in the movie while Catherine is away, but her like gloating about how well she knows Morris now was not in the movie. But from here on out, the book and movie endings are a bit different, so I'm going to talk about them separately, beginning with the book. So Catherine has an exchange with her father where he tells her, if you marry Morris, you are not getting any of my money when I die. And Catherine is like, I don't care, it doesn't matter. And he's like, well, you should tell Morris because I think he will care. And they also have different conversations, which makes Catherine realize, like, my father despises me, like he doesn't love me. And so when she sees Morris, she tells him, like, my father will disinherit me if we marry. But not only that, like, I I've realized he actually just doesn't like me. So he is never going to soften up. We can never ask him for anything because not only does he not like you, he doesn't even like me, which is something I never even realized until now. So we can't count on him for anything. And at this point, Morris has gotten a job, which I'm kind of skeptical. Like, was this a legitimate job? I feel like we never find out for sure, but I was definitely suspicious whether or not this was even true. But he claims to have a job. And so he is with Catherine and he tells her like, oh, I need to go to New Orleans for business. So I'm going to be gone for a little while. And despite her pleas to get him to stay, he ends up leaving. And while he is gone, he writes her a letter saying like, I don't feel right being the reason you are disinherited. So I think we should call off the engagement. And also in the book, he meets with Mrs. Penniman and he tells her about what Catherine said and just all this drama going on with Catherine and her father and the disinheritance. And Mrs. Penniman in this moment, she realizes like, oh, like, yeah, you shouldn't marry her if you're not getting the money. And so it shows how little Mrs. Penniman thinks of Catherine too, because she's like, oh yeah, if Catherine doesn't have the money, then she's not good enough for you. So I totally agree that you should break it off with her. Which again, it just is sad, right? Because this whole time Mrs. Penniman has been encouraging them to get married. But then when Catherine doesn't have her money, Mrs. Penniman cares more about Morris than she does about Catherine. And so she's like, yeah, Morris, don't marry her if she's not giving you the money, essentially. But yeah, so Morris breaks it off with Catherine through a letter. And then sometime later, the father is asking Catherine, like, when should I expect you to leave? Because you're getting married still, right? And Catherine tells him, no, I broke it off with Morris. We're not getting married anymore. And the father, he tries to get more from this story. He's like, oh, like, how did he take it? Tell me more. But Catherine just won't really talk about it. And Mrs. Penniman doesn't talk about it either. So for the rest of his life, the doctor never really knows what happened. And he's so curious and he wants to know, but no one will tell him the exact details. But about 20 years pass and Catherine, she has two different men at different points who want to marry her, who the father approves of, but Catherine turns them down. And when she is in her early 40s, her father is very sick. And when he's on his deathbed, he has recently found out that Morris is back in town. And so he asks Catherine, are you planning on marrying Morris once I die? And she tells him honestly, she's like, I haven't seen Morris in over 20 years and I don't even think about him. And he's like, well, promise me that you will not marry him when I die. And Catherine has no interest in marrying Morris, but she refuses to promise this. And so she's like, I can't promise anything. And so because of this, the father writes her out of his will. He gives her the house, Washington Square, but he does not give her the $20,000 a year. But then later after this, Morris shows up at Washington Square because Mrs. Penniman ran into him. And so she encouraged him to come by and see Catherine, making him think there was still hope. And in the book, Catherine sees him and basically she tells him like, I'm not interested in you anymore. And she sends Morris away and he leaves. And Mrs. Penniman had been out in the hall like anxiously waiting to see what happens. And when Morris walks out and sees her, he gets upset, being like, why did you have me come here? Like, this was pointless. She's not interested in me. And that is how the book ends. Whereas in the movie, things are a bit more dramatic. So they return from Europe, and while they are home, she is talking with her father. And this is when the father is just very cruel. He says a lot of mean things. And this is when he is saying, like, Morris only wants you for your money, but you're not getting my money if you marry him. And yeah, throughout this conversation is when Catherine realizes, like, wow, like, my father despises me. And Morris, he had been hiding outside because Mrs. Penniman, she had arranged a secret meeting. So Morris had been outside hiding. But then Catherine sees Morris outside and she runs to him. And they make plans for Morris to return that night at 12:30 to pick her up so that they can go and elope. And after they make these plans, she then tells him about this argument she had with her father. And she's like, yeah, my father hates me, so we can never ask anything of him. He will never come around. He will always disapprove of this marriage. So we are never going to talk to him again and we can't count on him for anything. And Morris in the movie, you can tell he's like, he's starting to get a little hesitant, but they part ways with plans for him to return at 12:30 to pick her up so they can go get married. And so at 12:30, she comes downstairs to anxiously await Morris when Mrs. Penniman also comes down because she heard the noise, I guess. And so Catherine tells her that Morris is coming to pick her up to be married. And Mrs. Penniman is so excited for her. But then Catherine tells Mrs. Penniman about the argument with her father and that he has disinherited her. And then Mrs. Penniman is like, oh, did you tell Morris that? And Catherine is like, yeah, of course I told Morris. And Mrs. Penniman is like, oh, I wish you would have waited to tell him that until after you were married. And after that, Catherine asks why, to which Mrs. Penniman replies like if only you were just a bit more clever. And this is interesting too, because in the book, Mrs. Penniman, she is all for Morris calling it off when she realizes Catherine doesn't have the money. Whereas in the movie, she still wants Catherine and Morris to get together, but this scene shows that she knew Morris's intentions, right? Like she knew Morris just wanted the stuff. He wanted the money. And so while she still wishes they would have gotten married, she still knew that Morris was only after her for her money. And needless to say, Morris abandons Catherine. He leaves her high and dry, and come morning, Catherine dejectedly walks up the stairs, resigned to living with a father who hates her. And then very soon after this, the father gets very sick and he is about to die. And he asks Catherine, like, oh, you're still getting married, right? And she tells him no, like we ended the engagement. And the father, he's like, oh, you broke it off with him. Like, I'm so proud of you. You called it off. Nice job. But then she rips that pride from him by being like, no, father, he deserted me. But you know what? I still love him. And if he came back, I would still marry him. And they have this discussion. And the father, he says how like, I'm protecting you because you would have married and lived with a man who didn't love you. And that would have been a miserable life. But then she says something like, I don't see what would have been so bad about it because I've lived with you for the last 20 years. And that whole time, I had no idea until now that you didn't love me. There's a lot to get into with that line. For example, like maybe she was drawn to Morris because he was like her father in many ways, including the fact that neither of them loved her. So maybe she wouldn't have known what it felt like to actually truly be loved because she had never experienced it. And so what Morris provided her kind of wasn't that far from what the dad provided her, right? Because neither of them loved her. So she didn't know what it was to be loved. So I think that's interesting. But then, yeah, obviously, like if you think about it, if she had just married Morris, maybe her life wouldn't have been so horrible. I don't know. Like, I'm sure he would have spent her money like crazy, but I guess it's for the best they didn't get married. But she makes a good point, being like, I was with you for 20 years living happy, not realizing you didn't love me. So maybe I would have been happy with Morris, not realizing that he didn't love me either. And anyway, they go on to say all sorts of things to each other. And she tries to get him to change his will, being like, you should write me out of your will before you die. And she even brings out the paper and pen, but he can't bring himself to do it. And so ultimately he ends up dying without amending his will. So she does get all of the money in the movie. And then some years pass and Mrs. Penniman again runs into Morris. And so she brings him by the house. And at first, Catherine is very cold to Morris, but then she kind of switches and she's like, yes, I do still want to marry you. And so they make plans for Morris to return that night so that they can go and be married. But then when Morris returns, he is knocking on the door and Catherine has the door bolted. And then while he is pounding on the door, calling her name, she walks up the stairs and goes to bed. And when Mrs. Penniman, after Morris leaves and Mrs. Penniman realizes that Catherine wasn't being genuine in saying she still wanted to marry Morris, she says something like, can you be so cruel? And Catherine says, yes, I was taught by the masters. And also previously this same evening, the maid had complimented Catherine's dress. And then she asked if she and the cook could go on a walk. And Catherine is very harsh with her. And she's like, you didn't need to pay me a false compliment just so you could get something in return. And so in general, it seems like Catherine is very harsh and unhappy in many ways. And we saw her previously with her aunt who came to visit with like her cousins or whatever that relation would be. And she's like happy in the moment with them. But as soon as they drive away, like her smile leaves her face so fast. And the aunt also says like, oh, you should come up for the summer. Like we always invite you and you never come. And so it just seems like she is just holed up in Washington Square wearing her nice gowns, but just kind of bitter and jaded. And again, when she was young, she was so gullible and naive. But now, and she always assumed the best of people and assumed they were being honest. But now it seems like she's just on the opposite end of the spectrum. And now she just assumes the worst in people. And of course, Morris was a horrible person for abandoning her. But then also like the lengths she goes to get her revenge on him also kind of speaks to how she has changed over the course of the story, right? Because in the book, she didn't seem like as bitter and jaded in the book. And when she turns Morris away, she like just tells him to his face that like, there's nothing here. I don't want to marry you, you know? And then he leaves. So she could have done that in the movie, which is the nicer way to let him down. But she takes things further, right? And leads him on just so he can be left abandoned and deserted just like he deserted her. So yeah, I feel like the fact that she takes her revenge to the next level also kind of speaks to, again, just kind of how harsh she has become through the years after this experience with Morris and her father. And then also in the movie, something that is exclusive to the movie is the fact that she is very good at embroidering. And this is something the father mocks her for near the end. And this night when Morris comes by, she's doing an embroidery piece. And she says that once she finishes this one that night, she is never embroidering again. And so this just seems like, she's finally closing the chapter on this part of her life, closing the chapter on this part of who she was, But when it comes to book versus movie, so I liked this book so much. I would highly recommend it, even though I disliked the characters so much. Even Catherine, right? For most of the book, I felt bad for her and I pitied her, but she was also annoying again because she was so gullible and Morris was so obviously mercenary and yet she was falling for it. But yeah, despite the characters being so unlikable, I loved the book. And the characters, they were just so fully realized. They didn't feel like caricatures. They did feel real. And again, just Morris, there's one part I forgot to mention, is how in the book, we see how he is manipulating Mrs. Penniman, acting like they're bosom friends, but we get his inner thoughts and we know that he thinks Mrs. Penniman is a fool and he can't stand her. And in the movie, we sort of see this because there's a part when Catherine and Dr. Sloper are returning from Europe and Mrs. Penniman and Morris have cooked up this plan of him to secretly meet Catherine. And so he's talking to her being like, okay, what to tell Catherine, right? You know the plan. And she's like, yeah, you're meeting Catherine at 6 p.m. And he's like, no, I'm meeting her at 9 p.m. And in that moment, you can just see that he's like, oh, this lady, she's so stupid. This is what I have to work with, And the movie does have a lot of moments of humor throughout, despite the fact that it is a drama. But then also with Morris, I love the part in the movie where Catherine makes him think that they are still going to get married. This is at the very end. And she goes upstairs real quick to get something. And we see Morris just walking through the house. And you can see the house, the things, the stuff, the money, that is what he loves. And he's just yes, I'm home, this is all going to be mine. And so just the way he treats the house, you can tell that's what he loves, not Catherine. So anyway, fantastic performances in this movie. And Olivia de Havilland even won an Oscar for her performance. And then the movie ending, it does not matter how many years, how many decades go without watching this movie, him pounding on the door, calling her name as she walks up the stairs. It is an unforgettable scene. Whereas in the book, it wasn't anticlimactic, I guess, but it almost was kind of that's it. She just tells him no and sends him away. Because I had seen the movie first, and so I was expecting something more dramatic than we got in the book. And so yeah, ultimately, when it comes to book versus movie, I do think the movie wins. I think this is fantastic. And sometimes in movies, when they make things more dramatic, like I said, that can annoy me, but I just think they do it so well in this movie. And so I'm fine with the changes they make. And again, that ending, it's unforgettable. So anyway, I highly recommend this movie. Fantastic. But I would recommend the book too, because I am really glad I read that. And Henry James is a very famous author, so I'm glad I've read something of his now. But then I also wanted to mention that Washington Square was adapted into a play first, and it is the script of the play, which was then adapted into the movie The Heiress. And they still will run this play on occasion. And in 2012, The Heiress returned to Broadway, and we had Jessica Chastain as Catherine, who I love. And then we had my beloved David Strathairn. He is an amazing actor, and he played Dr. Sloper in this production. So you can watch clips of it on YouTube, but I'm man, that would have been so cool to have seen in person. But anyway, I actually would love, as much as I love The Heiress, I would love to see them remake this movie, but set it in modern times, put a modern spin on the story. In the right hands, I think that could be really good. I feel like Sofia Coppola, even though I hate her remake of The Beguiled, I don't hate it. I was very disappointed with her remake of The Beguiled, but nonetheless, I feel like maybe she could do a good job at readapting this, or Jane Campion, maybe someone like that, or someone else. I don't know, but I would love to see a modern take on The Heiress. I know it would be controversial, and so many fans of The Heiress would be so upset they were remaking it, but anyway, I want to see that happen. But speaking of modern remakes, so I want to talk about the 1997 movie. This movie, it takes place in the 1800s. They don't modernize it, and it stars Jennifer Jason Leigh as Catherine, and I love Jennifer Jason Leigh. Like whenever I see she's in a movie, it gets me excited. And yet I just found this movie kind of dull and I was pretty disappointed with it. Her portrayal of Catherine, especially in the early parts of the movie, I just wasn't loving it. And then also at the start of the movie, we see her when she is like 10 or 12 years old and we see how overeager she is to please her father. And we also see that she is overweight as a child. And that is true to the book. In the book, we hear that Catherine was like a very robust child and woman. But yeah, we get a scene where she's like 10 or 12 and she is performing a song for her father in front of a group on his birthday, and she gets so nervous that she pees her pants. And this was not in the book. That is exclusive to the 97 movie. But something this movie mentions that the Heiress did not is that not only did the mother die in childbirth, but before Catherine, the mother had given birth to a son who also died. So 2 people had died before Catherine. So again, it just shows how the way the father is, I don't know, he has just like so much negativity towards Catherine, not only for who she is, but also things she couldn't even control, like the fact that he had a son he lost and then that his wife died in childbirth, you know? But then she and Morris, I feel like they do have good chemistry, but first of all, when they are introduced in the book and the Heiress, Morris wants to meet Catherine, like he knows all about her. Whereas in the movie, this movie, it seems like the cousin tells Morris, like, oh, Morris, come here, like, come meet Catherine. And then they're both like super clumsy, like to the point where they're falling over each other in the street at one point. And I'm assuming that Morris is pretending to be overly clumsy as a way to like bond and be less intimidating to Catherine. But I felt like that was kind of a bit too much. But then in this movie, we also see them bond through playing the piano, which I did think was sweet, actually. But then they make a big change where here, Morris does talk to Dr. Sloper before proposing. But not only that, in book and all the movies, there is a part where Dr. Sloper asks him why he loves Catherine. And he says like, oh, Catherine, she's just so charming and delightful. And in all versions, the dad is like, I know my daughter's virtues and she is not charming or delightful. And so in the Heiress and in the book, Morris, he calls her charming and delightful, and then he ends it at that and they move on. And so the reader and the watcher, we see like, wow, Morris doesn't actually pay attention to Catherine, because if he did, he would know that charming and delightful are not the adjectives to use to describe her, right? And that is what clues the father in, among many other things. He's like, wow, he doesn't know my daughter at all. Whereas in the 97 movie, he calls her charming and delightful. And then from there, he goes on to name other things like, oh, she's so honest and she's so good. And these are things that are true of Catherine, right? So now he's saying things that actually make sense. And then he also admits, like, I'm also a very vain person, and Catherine treats me like I'm the most important person in the world, which feeds my ego, and I like that. And so in general, it seems like Morris here, he wants her for her money, but he also seems to be more genuine, and he at least sees Catherine for who she is. Whereas in the book and in the Heiress, Morris, he doesn't get to know Catherine. He doesn't know what her good qualities are. And so when he's asked, he's just like, oh, she's very charming. So yeah, Morris here, they made him more likable. And yet, like the book, she tells him that she has been disowned essentially and that she won't get any money. And then he tells her like, well, I need to go away on business. And then he leaves her. But the movie has an added scene where after he kind of disappears, she goes to see him and he straight up tells her, like, our deal was to trade your money for my beauty, because he's an attractive man. And he's like, but now that you don't have your money, the deal is off, you know? And so he's very blunt and straightforward with her in that. And that is not in the book or in the Heiress. And then the very end is very much like the book, where the father, he wants her to promise not to marry Morris, even though she hasn't seen him in a long time. And she refuses to promise. And so therefore the father writes her out of the will. And then Morris shows up, they talk, she turns him away, the end. And in this one, Catherine definitely is not harsh and jaded, and in fact we see her teaching children, and she has a sweet moment with one girl in particular. So in this version, it seems like she is at a much better place, and she's not this bitter, jaded woman like she was in the Heiress. But yeah, so there's things about this movie that I liked well enough, but ultimately, again, 15 minutes in, I was wanting to turn it off, honestly, because it was not drawing me into the story. But I wanted to watch it for the sake of this video, and I was also curious what they would do with the ending. So I'm glad I watched it, but I honestly, it's not one I would highly recommend. If you're going to choose between the two movies, definitely watch The Heiress instead. But this movie does have some decent reviews online, so there are some people who like it. So yeah, I guess you can watch it yourself and decide what you think, but yeah, it's not one I ever intend to watch again. And yeah, that wraps it up on the Heiress / Washington Square. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Let me know if you have seen this movie. Let me know if you have read this book, or let me know what other Henry James books you have read. He has a book called The Beast in the Jungle, which was loosely adapted into The Beast, which is this new French film that has gotten great reviews. So I have wanted to do a book versus movie video for that one, but then I just never did. But yeah, let me know if you would be interested in that. But yeah, anyway, thank you again for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, share your thoughts down below in the comments, and I will see you next time. Bye.